Very, very exciting program ahead of us. We're going to focus on the topic of the world in flux. And as we're all experiencing, the world is now overwhelmed by conflicts in the Middle East, in Asia, in Eastern Europe, obviously overnight in Australia. We're also going to talk about the skills gap, both here and in Europe, which is causing widespread youth unemployment. And then we continue to experience challenges in getting there on a trade agreement. We can't solve all of these challenges using our traditional or old playbook, and that's why the discussions that we're having today are so important. And for today's discussion, the Institute has assembled a prominent group of CEOs, policymakers, and academics who are going to share their views on these topics and those that are central to the German-American relationship. Germany's prominence in the world has risen dramatically over the past decade. Many would say that Germany is the voice of Europe. And together, both Germany and the United States have an opportunity to take on new roles in the changing world order. We can learn from one another. You're going to hear a lot of that reflected in our panelists today. I'd like to take a moment in advance to thank our panelists for joining us. And I'd like to extend a very special and warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Bob Zoellick, who Jack Janes is going to introduce in a moment. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jack Janes, who, in addition to being a good friend, is the great leader of the Institute. He's the visionary behind the Institute, and together with our world-class staff, does great things in order to strengthen and to study the German-American relationship. Jack, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jack. This is the third symposium that we've had in the series leading up to these annual gala events, and we're so happy that they've grown every year. My job is relatively short and sweet. I have the advantage of having worked at this institution for 26 years. There are people in this room, and I'm looking at one right now, that was with me in 1989, guided me along the way. 26 years later, we have an array of people that have worked with us over the years, and one of them is this gentleman sitting to my left. We had the pleasure of having Bob on our board in the time frame that, and it was a difficult time frame to have because everybody wants a piece of Bob Zoellick. And Bob was called back into governmental service, as you all know, in the Bush administration. He has been instrumental, as you perhaps also remember, in the days of the so-called 2+4 meetings, worked with Jim Baker to make German unification a reality. And I think that all of you are aware of the fact that that was a very, very seminal time, and Bob was right in the middle of that. So I think, Bob, as we celebrate the 25th anniversary of the wall coming down, you have a special reason to be proud, and all of the people that you worked with at that time. So what we want to do, as Jack just said, is talk a little bit about the issues that we're facing at on the global stage, those that we're working on at the Institute, and those we'd like to share with you today. Let me just make one final point. Somebody just right before we sat down here said, so what do you guys do? Apart from having a name that is unpronounceable. What we do is we think about ideas that are important for the German-American relationship, and we try to operationalize them for those that are engaged. All of you are in that category. We hope that you'll walk away from this particular seminar, this symposium, and know that the Institute is a source of analysis, a source of insights, and a source of networking. That's all we do, and we are looking forward to involving all of you into that particular world that we occupy. So without any further ado, with great pride, former AICGS trustee Bob Zoellick. Welcome.
Well, I want to thank all of you for the invitation to be here today, and I'm delighted to see so many different friends from different aspects of my career. And I also want to thank all of you for your support of AICGS and your commitment to U.S.-German relations. I think AICGS is especially important now because I suspect we're in a transitional phase of U.S.-German relationships and the partnership that rose from the ruins almost 80 years ago. And I also want to express my personal thanks to Jack and his chair, Paul Aucklander, who I've known very well over the years, very skillful as well as a likable chair, and for their contributions. And I also want to join Jack, and he picked out exactly the right word about the vision that Jack Janes has offered, along with, I think, devotion and ideas that have kept a very strong organization with a very small but high-powered staff. So you really made a fantastic contribution. And having worked a little bit with Allianz over the years, I can't think of a better honoree than Michael Diekman, who of course is guided by the indomitable Wolfgang Ischener. And I also saw that you have Ambassadors Braun and Wittig, as well as Wolfgang and Ambassador Matusik here today. And when you think of that roll call, that's an incredible example of what the German diplomatic service has brought, not only to Germany and the world, but to U.S.-German relations. They're really people who are not only skilled diplomats, but I count each as a friend. But I'd like to start off your event today with a bit of a step back, because I want to take a slightly more distant vantage point from which we can have a perspective on U.S.-German relations. And it turns out that almost exactly 25 years ago, this very day, in 1989, I was riding with Secretary of State James Baker across the Glencoe Bridge, which, as many of you know, was the scene of the spy exchanges in the Cold War, to some meetings in Potsdam. Now, all of you know Germany, so you know that darkness falls early in Germany in December. And I recall that trip as one where the day seemed particularly dim. The lighting in East Germany was poor. It seemed like it was a cloudy, overcast day. The very few cars that we saw on the street had very weak headlights. Only a month earlier, the wall had opened, as we now know, by accident. So just as your topic for today suggests, this was a time of flux and uncertainty. And the path to possible unification of Berlin, of Germany, of Europe was also lit by the very dimmest of lanterns of those days. There's a tendency when we know the outcome to think things that are preordained, but it certainly wasn't clear on December 12th, the day we made the trip. On the day before, on December 11th, Secretary Baker had given a major speech in Berlin, which was designed to explain the U.S. approach to these very dramatic events, outline some principles, but also to try to create some structure of a concept for a Germany whole and free in a more integrated Europe, in a new NATO, and an evolving CSCE. Because it was important at this moment, most of all, that the U.S. try to give, amidst the fluidity, some sense of where this process could go. Only a week before that trip, I had the privilege to be with President Bush and Secretary Baker in a stormy Malta, which was the first meeting that President Bush, as president, had with President Gorbachev. And I remember being at part of those sessions where President Gorbachev, fortunately, was expressing his confidence in President Bush, who used that meeting to have an outreach to the Soviet leader. But frankly, Gorbachev expressed some rather strong fears about Germany and the rapidity of events, which seemed to him to be destabilizing. Right after that meeting in Malta, President Bush arranged a NATO summit in Brussels, where he used the opportunity to try to reassure our European allies, who were also anxious, while also supporting Chancellor Kohl. So just within the space of a week or two, you can get a sense of the quick step events of the high politics of late 1989. But our visit to Potsdam had a very different aim. First, we wanted to encourage the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, in the form of the Prime Minister Modrow, to keep on a path to safe and free elections that would enable East Germans to finally be able to express their will. And that required avoiding some dangers that we frankly didn't know how deep they were, including risks with security services. But second, we wanted to look beyond the old DDR system to see the new faces and hear some of the new voices. So Secretary Baker arranged on short notice to visit the Nikolaikirche, the Lutheran church in Potsdam, to meet some of the very courageous pastors and lay people who had risked all to challenge the old order and to protest for freedom and to speak up for human dignity. This was a particularly influential trip for me because I had been raised as a Lutheran in Illinois in the 1950s and 60s. So when I sat in the church pew in this slightly cold church, the Nikolaikirche, and I would skim the hymnals or spotted some copies of Luther's Small Catechism, or I even recall picking up some Sunday school materials, I felt a very odd mix of sensations. The very familiar of years past, but also in a very, very strange landscape. And I was struck, as I listened to the East Germans there, of another disconnect. On the one hand, these Lutheran leaders were explaining how they wanted to create a new GDR, one that reflected Die Dritte Weg, the third way, that would be a new form between communism and capitalism. But when we asked them about their congregation, these very honest and courageous people sadly recounted that what the public wanted was what they saw on West German TV. They did not want a new socialist experiment. Now, this epiphany in December had two very important implications for us. One, unification would be a takeover by the Federal Republic of Germany, not a merger. There was only one legitimate Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, in the eyes of most Germans. And this took instrumental form in the use of Article 23 of the Basic Law of the Constitution to use as the legal structure for unification. But two, the German public, both East and West, would be a force in which our diplomacy had to take into account. So our challenge was not only the high politics of statecraft in capitals. Our challenge was also to respect the public will in streets, in churches, in homes, in community groups, and then to engage that public through symbols, through speech, and through the substance of our diplomacy. Let me just draw out the implications of that judgment for a minute. Only 2 months after this visit to Potsdam, we had had additional meetings in Western Europe, additional meetings in Eastern Europe, and Moscow. We arrived in Ottawa for what was supposed to be an Open Skies conference. And that's where we announced the creation of the 2+4 process for German unification. The two Germanys and the four powers that had preserved their rights after the victory of World War II coming out of the Potsdam Conference in 1945. Now, most accounts that you'll read of German unification recount the role of the 2+4, and it was a very important role in the diplomatic negotiations, and that's true enough. But I was very keenly aware on that day of the East German elections that were going to occur in March. And I kept wondering whether East Germans, who had not known free elections for over 50 years, if ever, might be skeptical about whether the old order, not just the GDR order, but the four powers, would really permit East Germans to vote for unification. And I hoped that the very announcement of that 2+4, the two Germanys, but also the four powers together, including the Soviet Union, might lead these East Germans, understandably skeptical, to say, yes, unification can really happen. We can really go to the polls and we can vote the public will. And indeed, as we all know, they then voted overwhelmingly for Chancellor Kohl and Foreign Minister Genscher's call for unity, despite a lot of the suspicion of the experts and the stronger historical associations with the Socialist Party, the Socialist Democratic Party. Then again, throughout the 2+4 negotiations, we drew on the energy of the East and West Germans to press the Soviets not to stall or try to block through force, and importantly, to tailor U.S. messages to show our alignment with the hopes and dreams of the German people, while also, importantly, pointing a way to reassure Europeans to the East and the West, laying a foundation for future transatlantic relations, and offering the Soviets some outcomes that could work to their advantage and could be explained to their home audiences. Now, you might find some of these reminiscences to be of historical interest, particularly on a 25th anniversary. But you might ask, what does this past have to do with Germany and Europe and transatlantic relations in the year 2014? Well, this audience is very well aware of the policy challenges of this era, and your agenda today covers many of the topics. Though I would suggest on other occasions you consider some topics of transatlantic cooperation on international or even global events such as the future of the Eurozone and the European Union in the world recovery, Ukraine, Russia, and the EU's eastern borderlands, Mideast, North Africa, Europe's southern approaches, even China and Asia. But my principal message today is that our success in facing these challenges depends not only on the policy of the experts and the statecraft and diplomacy, but on the temper, the will, and the heart of the German people. As Rick Byrd, the former U.S. ambassador to the Federal Republic of Germany in the 80s, shrewdly observed, Germans and Americans have gone through a bit of a migration. They had an initial era of fascination in the 1950s and 60s. There were also some very big fights in the 1970s and 80s about nuclear strategy and negotiations. Some of the people in this room were participants in that. Each has really taken the other a bit for granted. Yet by now, Americans and Germans probably know one another's strengths and weaknesses, and perhaps we're willing to work with one another as we are, not as we might wish one another to be. But this work depends on the public's interest and ultimately its support. Government officials can work together very effectively, but in democratic societies, they have to ultimately adapt to the public will. Political leaders, business leaders, opinion leaders need to invest in this conversation about transatlantic relations with their publics. Otherwise, a sense of direction, impeded by the inevitable frictions, could degrade into a sense of drift. Now, Americans and Germans won't always agree. We have different historical experiences, different political cultures, different perspectives. But then again, Americans don't always agree with one another, and Germans don't always agree with one another. We can respect our differences without being dominated by them. And we have some tremendous shared experiences too. I hope that Germans and Americans recognize what is now at stake with this partnership for the 21st century. At the time of unification, way back in 1989, our fast-paced diplomacy was not just ad hoc with the moment from meeting to meeting or reactive. We were guided by a strategic perception, a very important one. We believed that Germany would become the most important country in Europe while working within a more integrated Europe. And we believed, as President Bush said in Mainz in May of 1989, that the United States and Germany should be cooperative partners in leadership. Now, we knew the country we were talking about, and we knew the Germans would be reluctant. We know that Germans don't want to be seen as leaders, at least seen as leaders. We know unification would absorb German energies and monies, and a lot of money. And we know that some Germans are comfortable with not having to assume the international responsibilities or some of the choices that go with them. Some Germans would like to act as if Germany is a big Switzerland. And the promise of partnership, while it worked very well at the time of unification, faded in the years that followed. And there were shortfalls on both sides. Yet time has proven that that U.S. strategic assessment of 1989 was a correct one. Germany's size, its very success, particularly with the revelations through the financial crisis, have revealed that Germany is now dominant in Europe, even if it does not want to be perceived as dominating. Now, I understand the historical and human reasons for that caution. Yet it's important to recognize that Germany still lives on a frontier, no longer a frontier of contending armies. Germany's now on the frontier of contending ideas about the future of the world. This shouldn't be a cause for trepidation. Keep in mind the reassurance that this diplomacy of 1989 sought to create for a united Germany, in a united Europe, in a changing world order. This was not a new Mitteleuropa or Switzerland, but it was a democratic, respected Germany within a more integrated European Union, a secure Germany within an adapting NATO, and a Germany and the European Union that could contribute to the world economy. Now, of course, only Germans will decide on its country's future. I hope that the German public appreciates that the U.S. can assist, contribute to, and have a role in this future, as the U.S. sought to do in 1989. And I hope that the U.S. can nimbly support its German and European partners. But let me close by saying a word about another public's attitude. My remarks today have focused on the instrumental role of the German public's decisions in 1989. But the American public also played a role. I was, of course, proud to be one of the last of a long line of Americans who kept our promise over 40 years to support the unification of a democratic Germany in a secure NATO. But I was even more proud that when the moment of testing arrived, that the U.S. public instinctively shared the German public's excitement when the wall opened and unification became a real prospect. Average Americans naturally felt an association with the desire of Germans to unify in freedom. The U.S. public's focus on the future, not an obsession with the past, enabled it to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. And this attitude of the American public made it easier for U.S. officials to act with agility. I could give you many examples, but let me just share one with you. President Bush managed in the course of 1990 a very discreet mediation with Polish Prime Minister Mazowiecki about the Polish-German border without trying to compel Chancellor Kohl to adjust his position on the timing of when Germany would state that border, without having him back down publicly. President Bush could only do that because we had room to maneuver across the U.S. public and play that role. Now, at times, Americans have a tendency to assume that the world thinks as we do, and sometimes that can get Americans into trouble. But in 1989, the American public's fraternity with freedom served Germany, Europe, and the world very well. So I want to thank all of you for your efforts, your ideas, your friendship. And my request to all of you, Germans and Americans, is to try to work to connect the strategic vision and the ideas that you develop at this symposium and others to the public support. Perhaps a German sensitivity to the past, combined with an American focus on the future, can forge a wise partnership for another generation. And I know that AICGS will help us try. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Join me here.
You want to sit?
We have an opportunity to talk with Bob just a bit about what he just laid out. And if you don't mind, Bob, let me just remind you of a speech that your boss, President Bush, gave in Mainz in 1989, well before the wall came down.
It's the Partners in Leadership speech.
Exactly. And in that sense, could I be right if I suggest to you that at that point he was asking for partnership and leadership? I think Germany and the United States have leaders in partnership. Leaders, as you suggested, don't always agree. Is there anything that you think about when you look across the Atlantic toward Berlin? You were part of shall we say, the tension over Iraq. You know that there's some tension now on some of the NSA issues and some other things. Is there anything that bothers you particularly that you see as a danger sign for the drift that you mentioned in the relationship?
Well, as I mentioned in my remarks, I do think there's been drift. And in the order of things, I don't think it's going to be just pointed at one side for another. There's a tendency in international relations to sometimes take your friends and partners for granted. And I think it's a mistaken course. It's one that President Bush 41 in particular was a counterexample of. He built the relationships, Mitterrand, Thatcher, and others that helped us navigate this whole process, as well as countries all around the globe. And I think in this case, because there is such a range of interactivity between the United States and Germany, sometimes meetings become just opportunities to go through your talking points. You know, I attended all the G20 sessions, so I saw Presidents Merkel and Obama and others. And what I think we missed was a chance to have what I called for in another context of a broader strategic dialogue where you go offline, and I don't mean the types of strategic and economic dialogue now with China where it's a big bureaucratic exercise, but one goes off and has conversations about the other's perspective on individual issues so you understand them and can work with one another. My sense is that, at least at the governmental level, the U.S. and German governments understand the importance of this, but sometimes they get a little slip-slide. So let me give you an example, a very practical government example. So we had the bugging of Chancellor Merkel's phone, okay? That, in my view, was a mistake in the first place. I had similar sort of questions come across my desk at various points, and I used to say to people, what would you like to know? Because the Germans are pretty upfront and transparent, and if you would like to know Chancellor Merkel or Foreign Minister Genscher's view or whatever it is on this, why don't we ask them, okay? And what is the risk to trust if that is breached, okay? Now, what one needs to know about governments is intelligence services will go do their thing. And as the technology capability takes them, they'll use it. Okay? But at some point, you also have to exercise some judgment about the limits. The next stage of this was this ridiculous thing where somebody paid some money to a member of a German Bundestag staff to get something from a committee report, which probably they could have gotten through open source information anyway. And what really drove me nuts about that was that, again, somebody, either, I think we had a new ambassador that was a political appointee, he may not have known this, or the assistant secretary level should have sat down after the first incident and reviewed with the intel community, what are you doing? And kind of what's the trade-off of this? I talked about this with Bob Kimmon when he was ambassador. He did this. So this is just slipshod, okay? Now, let's move to another level. So what does this mean for intel, for example? Well, frankly, I think we should try to construct something with Germany that is a no-spy agreement for the governments, but recognize, and this is where the offline discussions are important, that the Hamburg cell for 9/11 was in Hamburg. And we do need the ability to be able to survey different types of communications so we identify these people before they kill or destroy us, or what you see perhaps happening in Sydney, Australia right now. There's room here for people to have have discussions about that. Frankly, I think that on Ukraine and Russia, the governments have come pretty well together. I think Chancellor Merkel's done a very good job of trying to bring along a different European polity. You know, frankly, I think the events of shooting down the Malaysian plane also shocked people. And while I may have differences with some of the German politics about arming Ukrainians to defend themselves or having forces in the Baltics, these are probably kind of at the margin. And people, if you're allies and partners, you can understand the degrees. Now, frankly, part of what I'm saying is you need to have, even with your friends, think about this with your family, think about the people you work with. It's easy to fall into assumptions. Now, the criticality of the U.S.-German relationship is we can't rely on sort of assuming we know it. We actually have to have those discussions. Now, why is this important, and particularly in this sort of era? Well, as I've suggested, Germany is going to be the most important country strategically. It's a time of change. Germans have to work through their own sort of politics. And I think that for the U.S. and Germany to better understand one another reminds me of a lesson that the U.S. kept learning during the Cold War. If you follow the pattern of diplomacy, presidents almost always started with their superpower counterpart, the Soviet Union. And sometimes they were a little insensitive to Germany, and particularly on the front line of the alliance. If you look at the pattern, and John F. Kennedy, I have done some research on this, is a wonderful example of this, where in part his speech in Berlin reflects his changing thought after the Cuban Missile Crisis. They come to the lesson that Dean Acheson said, which is you've got to start with your alliance partner. And to be honest, this is I won't drone on any further, but there's an interesting little revelation on this in unification. Some of the people in the U.S. who were focused on Gorbachev and the Soviet Union, and Strobe Talbot wrote this in one of his books, said, look, the U.S. was too focused on coal in Germany. Should have been more focused on Gorbachev. Frankly, I think Gorbachev's fall was due to things in the Soviet Union. It wasn't due to this. But that was a different mindset. And you have to ask yourself, we did this in about 11 months. And, by the end of 1990, Shevardnadze was resigned. You had a coup in August of 91. We had the Gulf War. This was a very narrow window. So my point is that we shouldn't be taking each other for granted. And then the message of this remarks, and this perhaps goes to your other point, is that where, I'm not in touch because I'm not in Germany enough, is the changing public attitudes. Look, I'm enough of an experienced diplomat that, gratitude and 25 cents will get you a quarter. So I don't expect that to carry forward for 25 years. And there are different public attitudes in Germany with a younger generation. And so does it bother me when I see younger Germans acting like the United States is more of a problem than Russia? Yes, but you go back in the Cold War, there was always strains of this. And so part of this is understanding that audience. And as Germans here will tell you on this issue of spying, for example, this just runs very deep. So Americans can comment on the security aspects, but this has a different issue. It's true for the Googles of the world. I mean, they need to understand I'm more sympathetic to the U.S. view of kind of big data and use of information. But if I'm advising a business, you better darn well understand what the attitudes of your customers are. So this is where, coming back to your dialogue and discussion, it starts with simply understanding what the other guy is thinking. And then I think we have enough common interest to say nothing of goodwill with German partners to cooperate. And all I can conclude with is, having worked with every continent around the world, including Antarctica for environmental purposes, the U.S. and Germans, while there's going to be differences, there's a heck of a lot of similarities compared to the rest of the world, and we ought to build on those.
Aren't you all glad that he was there in 1989, 1990, helping us through this window in 88?
President Bush and Baker.
You did a lot, Robert. Andreas, you're sitting in the Bundestag. You represent that generation that Bob was just talking about. Do you want to comment on what he said about these tectonic plate changes? Andreas Nick is a former trustee of AICGS and a current member of the German Bundestag.
Clearly, Bob, I'm very thankful for what you have summarized on the experience in '89, which I think was the absolute high point of German-American relations, and I think we were very
until you create the next stage.
Well placed to have George Bush and a number of key friends in power at the U.S. at that critical time window of our history. And I think one point that you made resonated the most with me in terms of what our problem may be today, and that is, I think, that there's a perceived lack of strategic thinking over the long term in foreign policy, which is a problem in the US, maybe also a problem with us, and to the extent that we are probably too much driven by short-term domestic politics concerns in the way we look at foreign policy issues. Obviously, that is always more obvious for you with your partner, so that is something that we are concerned with in the US. You may be concerned about that with us in Germany. And I believe this may also be a factor if you don't have this long-term sense of strategy behind your decision-making, why something like the over-reliance on short-term security agency information becomes so prevalent as we have seen. And if it's all too much about tactics and not about long-term strategy, this may be a temptation that decision makers seem to give into. And I think the more we can get this back to a long-term strategic dialogue and a better understanding of each other and what is driving decision makings, the more we can rebuild this into a productive way going forward. And clearly, we look with a bit of skepticism towards what's ahead of us in the next 2 years in the United States, with something that may become even more introspective and domestic. rather than looking to the outside world. And so far, we appreciate very much the discourse that you have initiated here. Thank you.
Can I just respond briefly?
Please.
Incidents will always drive policy, and you've got some experienced policymakers here. But your point, the reason I'm talking about a strategic context is that if you don't have a framework, then you may make reasonable judgments on individual issues, but you won't see the interconnections. So what I tried to touch on my remarks is even with the dramatic events of 1989, we were trying to say, how will this future unified Germany fit in Europe and transatlantic relations, dealing with Russia? And there's no guarantee, but it does offer some context. And it also offers the chance that you'll have a slightly more insightful perspective of your partners. And this is, the second point is there's not much that is done effectively in the international system without sort of effective partnership. And that comes to my third and concluding point, is that you're worried about the insularity of the United States or kind of inward looking. I think that actually that's changed over the past few months. And if I in a very broad brush stroke, look, the United States, after the financial crisis and 2 wars of a decade or more, understandably, people were weary. It's hard for democracies to fight long wars, and the cost and the sense of frustration obviously added up. And without trying to be judgmental, I think, President Obama partly succeeded against Hillary Clinton by saying I wasn't for the Iraq War, and he was going to have a bit of a recalibration. If he thought that Bush 43 moved too far, he was going to recalibrate. What's quite striking is that a series of events, and I think the most prominent one was the beheadings of ISIS, had a very sharp effect on American public opinion. And showing their wisdom, they basically thought, you know what, we can't walk away from this, but also when asked whether they think there are easy solutions, they think there's no easy solutions either. And what you're actually seeing over the past couple months is whether it's ISIS, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, whether it's China, whether it's environmental topics, I think you're going to find more of a sense that if the United States pulls back too far, vacuums are created. And that really brings me right back to the heart of the U.S.-German relationship. I think Germany, frankly, as President Gauck said at the Munich Security Conference about a year ago, is also having to realize its success. You've had an incredibly successful diplomacy over 50 and 60 years, but now you are where you are, and you're not Switzerland, and you're not Luxembourg. Now, you're not the United States either, so you come up with your own formula. And what I keep coming back to is, I think, in a hard-headed, realistic analysis, the European Union, the transatlantic relationship, maybe even a broader relationship of North America with Canada and Mexico, those should be the resonant chords of this relationship going forward. And that takes us to the agenda you're talking about.
And let me just point out that the first panel after we're done here talking with Bob is going to be exactly about these issues. But I want to take a couple more minutes and introduce the audience to the man who is the founding director of AICGS, Jerry Livingston, without whom we all would not be here. Jerry Livingston.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you all. I'm now with the German Historical Institute, and therefore I'd like to pose a historical question to you, Bob Zoellick, one that you're almost uniquely qualified to answer. And that question is, what commitments were given by Secretary Baker or by the President in 1989 to Gorbachev and the Soviets about stationing of NATO troops in A, Eastern Germany, and B, in countries further east from East Germany, and what commitments were given about the extension of NATO into the East European countries?
I have to start with the fact that the way you started this rare historical knowledge, it reminds me, I think it was Palmerston, who, and the Germans will appreciate this, when you dig into the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, they're a very complex relationship. And Palmerston, when once asked about the complexities of the question, said there's only 3 people that know the answer to that. He said, 1 died, 1 went mad, and I'm the 3rd, and I've forgotten. No. But I haven't forgotten. Obviously, this is a subject that historians will argue over. I think Mary Surratt wrote something in the Foreign Affairs on this. I happen to have a rather strong feeling that there was no promise and obligation, and I can give you a number. And by the way, the late Edward Shevardnadze said the same thing, which is as the Soviet foreign minister. I remember actually being in Moscow on the day before we signed the final settlement agreement in September, I think. Yeah, September of 1990. And we had a dispute that went to the very last evening and created a little heartburn with my German friends about what would be the role of non-German NATO forces in the DDR, in the Eastern Länder. I remember actually wanting to preserve flexibility on that point, because I could envision that Poland would one day come into NATO. It's a good example about thinking strategically, and you'd want the ability of forces to move across the eastern states of Germany. The issue was eventually resolved by making a note and saying this will be done, decisions by Germany as the sovereign state, taking into account these various issues. In addition, one of the things that I find a little troublesome about this is that if anybody, and maybe it's getting to be a small group now, ever negotiate with the Soviets, but I would suggest try the Russians. They're normally not too lax about putting things in documents if they want them. If you go look at the history of strategic arms or other weapons, they're pretty detailed, that stuff. You won't find any of this in documents. Now, obviously, what was triggered was the fact that Baker made an argument to Gorbachev when we were making the case for a united Germany and NATO. And he was making the argument about, it was frankly my reference to Middle Europa, would you prefer a united Germany that wasn't attached to the alliance, or would you prefer a united Germany that was connected with the alliance? And he made a reference about sort of U.S. forces not further east as part of that discussion. As it then, and this is kind of the history of the negotiation, as it then went on to the nature of the process for NATO, the core point that Gorbachev made his decision on in June of 1990 was that under the CSCE, now the OSCE, every country has the right to choose their alliance. So that was another sort of underscoring of the point. So, I realize there's an argument that will continue to go on about whether people were sensitive enough to Russian security. I never felt also that it was a very rational position for Russia to fear Poland in NATO or the Baltics in NATO. I don't really think the Baltics are on their way to St. Petersburg. But I think that there is a point about how Russia has perceived its security. And this is one of the issues that we're now dealing with Russia and Ukraine. Frankly, there was a view that I had that was tried to convince the Russians that they'd be more secure with a stable sort of transatlantic relationship and alliance. That obviously isn't a view that predominated kind of in sort of the circles in Russia, but it's a richer discussion to actually ask what's going on in the psychology of Russia today. So I'll kind of stop at that.
One more over here, and then we'll move on to the first panel.
I'm teaching at NYU, and here I'm affiliated with the German Academic Exchange Service. I enjoyed very much your optimistic approach to the relation between Germany and the United States.
There's a but coming here.
And,
Aber?
And I would always also very much agree that you say Germany is now leading in Europe, but it doesn't really want so much to lead. It's a little bit reluctant. Don't you think that this has to do with the public opinion? Because the public, and this was also a point you very rightly made, we have not only to have experts, but also to listen to the public. But the public, I think, in Germany is to some degree quite critical about the United States, which I see as a danger. And if you look at all these debates now, also demonstrations on, for example, TTIP, you can see that there is sort of a growing distance, and one says, oh, there is a European way of life and an American way of life. And I think there is really a problem. And what do you think about this relation between experts on the right way working on this interrelation, and on the other hand, the criticism of the public opinion?
You've really raised three different but related points. The first was the German attitude towards leading. Then was the German public attitude towards the U.S., which is a separate issue. And then the third is the sort of expert sort of public opinion. On the question briefly of whether Germany will play a leading role, or even more broadly German attitudes, the facts speak for themselves. I mean, if you go visit any capital in Europe, obviously people are looking principally to Germany. Now, it's not Germany alone, and this is why I mentioned the European integration and other aspects. This has implications for efforts to keep Britain in the EU. It has implications for if the French put forward on structural economic reforms, how I hope Germany and others will respond. But I think the reality is that Germany has that place. And so if you're an American and you want to nudge Germany, this is partly my point about the dialogue. Look, in general, the American view of economics would probably say, look, we wish there were more expansionary policies coming out of Germany and you've got a large current account surplus and so on and so forth. But as Mario Monti once said to me, he said, Bob, you have to understand in Germany, economics is a branch of moral philosophy. So this will not be discussion of Keynesianism or monetarism. It's hard work, rectitude, discipline, so on and so forth. Now, what would that argue? It means if you're a shrewd diplomat, you might try public infrastructure, because that's investing in the future. But even better, frankly, I think the U.S. should, and instead of going head-to-head with something that Schäuble is just going to disdain, or the German Bundestag is going to disdain across party lines, what about something that would build up private sector demand? So what about some investment tax credits? What about, because frankly, German investment has been slipping. What about some depreciation allowance? There are tools one could use. But that's a very good example of if you're in a dialogue with a partner, even if you don't agree with them, if you understand where they're coming from, how can you try to find some sort of commonality of ground? Now, your second question dealt with the question of German public attitudes. Look, the things that you cited, or even ones that I've read, of course, I find sort of troubling and disappointing. But I find that in newspapers all over the world. So, so you have to kind of, how are you going to sort of deal with it? And I guess my main point would be, this is where my message about kind of leadership at home with your public. Okay, so I'm partly calling here for German opinion leaders and others to frankly not always just slide by what is the sort of the politically correct position and make the argument on the other side. So, it was actually useful for people to learn that maybe Germany spies on Turkey. Maybe it's useful for Germans to realize that they're under a terrorist threat. Wolfgang Schäuble made some of these points. There need to be more Germans that make some of these points. There need to be more Germans in the business community that don't only say, oh, we've lost business in Russia, but maybe our commonalities with the United States and others, actually are going to be the importance for the future sort of international economic system. You touched on TTIP. You're exactly right. TTIP is in very dangerous waters. It's partly the fault of the United States not moving the agenda. It's partly the EC processes. But I'll tell you the biggest thing that I worry about, Germany was traditionally the strongest supporter of free trade in Europe, along maybe with Sweden, a couple others. I wouldn't count on it on TTIP today. The politics are changing. This will be a challenge for Chancellor Merkel, who was one of the big proponents, and others to stand up for it. Now, on the other side, are there things that the U.S. can do in the negotiations? Yes, I believe there are, and we could go into kind of some of those aspects too. But it's a good example of basically how we need to kind of speak to the public. And I guess I'm not eventually worried about the U.S. public's attitudes of engagement with Germany. There's actually a pretty good residue here. Most Americans respect Germans. They think highly of Germany. They see it as a success. I am a little concerned about the German public attitude towards the U.S. among some people. But you always have to be careful not to overstate this, okay? So one of the wonderful things about German unification, I met the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung representative in in Washington, and I spoke at one of their events. And when I was there, it turns out his family is from Bautzen and Gorlitz. And coincidentally, some of my...
back there.
Oh, okay. Good to see you. I hope you don't mind my story. If so, you're going to listen to it anyway. My family's also from Bautzen and Gorlitz. Okay, and when we were talking about some of the events in Central and Eastern Europe and the lessons, first off, I thought it was wonderful that Konrad Adenauer Stiftung had somebody from the East that is now integrated in the system. I knew it would take maybe 20 years, but it's happened. And when I go to the finance ministry or other ministries, I often ask, where are you from? And I was very pleased that the finance ministry also had brought in people from the East. But his comment when I asked about the major sort of lesson, all of this, he said, freedom isn't free. That's a good lesson for all of Germans to recognize. He's younger, of a different generation, so when we're struggling with the issues of Russia or Ukraine or the Baltics or others, we realize these aren't all gifts. Now, one last strategic point on this. When I tried to wind through this, and I think, I think still the center of Germany is in this position, is some of these difficult topics that we're talking about will be easier for Germany if it's working with U.S. and North America, okay? And, whether it's the NATO role or others. And there's things the U.S. can do that Germany can't do. And there's things Germany might do that the U.S. can't do. That's skillful diplomacy and understanding the strategic structure if you have those sort of conversations. So in some ways, you brought it all very much to a head, and I hope that Germans here, but also Americans, realize they need to speak to a broader audience. I'm sorry, I'm running out, but there's one other point on this. I do some work with a friend of mine who's a CEO in Paris. And when I'm there for a few days, they often have me speak to a group, and I was very disturbed. I mean, these are sort of in the way that French society is. This is sort of the top tier of scholars and business and others. And he said, oh, it's so nice you're here. There's very few American and former officials that come through and talk to us about these things anymore. This is a mistake, okay? And it really goes back to the nature of the types of diplomacy I talked about under Bush 41. George Shultz used to call it tending the garden, okay? And there's a danger if people see diplomacy as just racing off to see how many miles you get, how many meetings you go to, how many talking points you do, and you don't kind of build these foundations. Because inevitably, when something serious happens, you better have them intellectually and you better have them personally.
And on that level, I can only say that's what we do at AICGS. So thank you, Bob. What a wonderful way to start a symposium, which we're going to go right into. Gail, if you'll bring up your panel right now, and we will continue this discussion almost immediately as we say goodbye to Bob Zoellick.